Yeah, so, 请原谅. I don't think my Chinese is so good to explain all these points. But I'm so happy to be here, and I read a bit more about Valley Rain and your philosophy and your objective, which is to advance the spiritual and material understanding of the members and to promote understanding and unity among people. So I was so happy to read these objectives because they are ones that I share and feel very deeply about. And so I think we have a common purpose, and today's talk I think is very much in line with the mission of Valley Rain, which is about how do we solve disputes and through the process of consultation. So today I thought to keep my remarks somewhat brief so we can have more discussion. There would be three parts. The first part is to talk a little bit about what are the practical benefits or application of consultation in two different settings, just to give an idea of how consultation can be useful. The second part is to talk a little bit about the actual practice and the approach to consultation. What is consultation? What are the material, practical, spiritual dimensions of consultation? And then the last part would be to discuss what is the relevance or relationship between consultation and our evolving development towards a more peaceful society. How does it relate to our achievement of peace in the world? Okay, so the first part, what are some of the scientific or practical dimensions? So I think about 10 years ago, as I understand, I know we have software engineers here, so Google conducted an internal study. Because there are so many different kinds of teams within Google, they thought, how about we look at what makes a team effective? What is it that makes a team function well, achieve high levels of outcome, is productive, is efficient? And so they studied thousands of teams within Google for 10 years. I think it was called Project Aristotle. And they analyzed all the various metrics of these teams. And then they finally found there were two characteristics of teams that made them very high functioning. And these two characteristics were very different from their expectation. They thought, okay, at the outset, it's probably very smart, high IQ, very intelligent people, that's going to be the best team. But what they found was very different. It was actually the characteristic, the dynamic, the spirit of the team, which was very important. And there were two dimensions to that. One was what they described as conversational turn-taking, meaning that within the groups that functioned very well, everyone in that group had a relatively equal chance to express their view. There wasn't one person in that group who dominated the others. So everyone had a turn, everyone had a space to share their input. And all those views were respected and encouraged. The second element of the team that they found important was what they called psychological safety. In the teams that functioned well, people felt respected and they felt embraced by the team. They felt that they could be their full self, their true self in that group. They didn't have to put on a work face mask. They were accepted and they had the space to freely express their view. And they were cared for in some extent. The manager, whoever it was, they expressed care. So I thought that was really interesting that these were the two dynamics where teams really functioned at a very high level and achieved very innovative, very outstanding results. We look at another example, which is something that I had studied. Oh, yes.
The other question.
Yeah.
So actually, this result is, as I see, is a bit potentially tricky because it's possible that it's those teams who are doing actually things that are easier to achieve, or doing things that they were pre-chosen to be better, and then it gives these people like firms and grits and spirit or psychological safety. Because this project is more promising, then I feel safe. I don't get exhausted or painful because of failures. So this kind of reverse causality, how do you deal with it?
Well, you know, that's the thing. So as I understand, I didn't look very specifically at the design of their study, but I understand that they did a lot of regression. They tried to control for a number of variables to sort of see, are these similar levels of, say, complexity or similar levels of challenged so that they could then extract common indicators across a variety. And as I understood, they tried to account for many of these variables, but I don't know all the details. So I would say look at the studies specifically and explore. But that's a good question, you know. But from what I understand, they studied thousands, and so this was the two kind of indicator that they found common. But it's something to explore, for sure. And maybe we could come back to that also in our discussion. So the second example is in the disaster context. So one of the projects I worked on some years ago was looking at how do communities engage or participate in disaster response. What are some dynamics of this? And so the World Bank in 2004 was faced with the tsunami in Indonesia. There was a major tsunami that killed thousands of people. Many houses, thousands of houses were destroyed. And a member of the World Bank also was familiar with consultation principles, George Soraya. And he said, okay, how about we test out this approach in a group of villages where we use what was later come to be described as a community-driven development model. And this consisted in the community members selecting 9 individuals from within their community to make decisions on redesign, procurement of materials, time frame, etc. And the requirements of those councils, individuals voted for them by secret ballot. So there was no campaign or nomination, and they were asked to consider individuals who would be trustworthy, fair-minded, wise, etc. And often the composition of these councils was very different from the political composition of the leadership of those communities. But these were individuals entrusted to help make decisions about rebuilding and design. And so they were trained in some of these principles of consultation, and they then were given the task of designing and procuring material to build these homes. And then they studied 5 or 6 or 10 years after this project to see what was the result of this CDD model versus the top-down model. And they found that this community-driven model, the occupancy rate of the homes that were built was at 94%, which is a very high percentage, meaning people liked the homes, they used the homes, they were occupying the homes that were rebuilt because they reflected the aspiration and the style and the patterns of life of the people in that community. They also found that it was 50% more efficient. So they used materials which were from local indigenous materials. They didn't have to ship things from far away or get consultants from a very far distance. They were able to build on local capacity. So these were some examples of how consultation has been used in different contexts to some benefit, to some beneficial effect. So then now we come to sort of what is consultation? How do we practice consultation? So I know some of you are familiar with Baha'u'llah, who is a great teacher who came around born in 1817. And he described consultation as this light which in a dark world can lead the way and guide us. So in many situations either in our family life, our work environment, our political life, we can face darkness. We don't know what is the right course of action to take. Should we do this? Should we go with that position? Should we take this other course of action? So he's saying that consultation is like a light, which in a very dark situation can lead the way for groups and help guide us. So then also described, and I don't know if I'll just highlight a few points about what is the nature of consultation. It's also something that is a sign of the maturation of humankind. It's a sign of the maturing capability of the human race. So one thing that we see different at this stage of history as opposed to 1,000 years ago is that most of the population has some access to reading, writing, the ability to seek truth, right? So with this capability, we have this ability to then engage in collective decision-making. So it's a process by which we can solve problems based on the view or the understanding that no one person is correct or has 100% of the reality in their mind. One of the things that the son of Baha'u'llah said is that he said that the greatest obstacle, the fact that we think ourselves to be right and other people wrong, is one of the greatest obstacles in the path towards unity. And unity is necessary if we are going to achieve truth. So one of the conditions of consultation then is recognizing with humility that we have a very small piece of knowledge and that many people can contribute to that knowledge. And I think it echoes what they found at Google, that so many, when we take turns in a group to speak or when we're deciding something, we're going to come up with a better outcome than one person dominating the decision or the manager, for example. Then he talks about what are the spiritual capabilities of consultation. So here it says the prerequisite are purity of motive, radiance of spirit, and detachment. So purity of motive, meaning our goal, our objective is to seek the best solution that we can for this given situation. Not to please the boss, not to try to outsmart someone in the group or to get a promotion. That's not our motive, right? The motive is how do we achieve the best result for this particular issue that's being discussed. Radiance of spirit, meaning detachment and looking for, trying to listen to others and think about what are others having to contribute. Then there's another passage. It says, the members who are consulting should behave in the utmost love, harmony, and sincerity towards one another. So thinking about how we speak and how we share our view, how we treat one another in the group, that we have a space where everyone feels comfortable to share their opinion and viewpoint. And then the last part was very interesting. It says, the members should take counsel in such wise that no occasion for ill feeling or discord may arise. And this is attained when everyone in that group can express with absolute freedom their own opinion. And should anyone oppose, he must on no account feel hurt. So we shouldn't take our opinion and associate it with ourselves. We should say this is an opinion for the group. If someone has a different opinion, it's not an attack on us, it's just a different way of seeing that issue. And it says that the shining spark of truth comes forth after the clash of differing opinions. So after we have different opinions being shared openly, we can have a spark of truth. And then ideally, if we can come to a unanimous, like a collective decision, that's ideal. But if not, we can have a majority opinion can be effective. So it's interesting because some people say unanimity of decision making. There's some studies at MIT that are advocating we have to have consensus building in all matters. But in some cases, if we require consensus, it's very possible for like a minority to stop any progress. So sometimes you have to have a majority of opinion. Okay, so then how does this relate to peace building? What's interesting, as I mentioned, Baha'u'llah came around 200 years ago, and at the time when most of his life was spent in suffering, in prison, because of this particular period of time when many of the ideas that he was sharing were very different from the current system in place. So he wrote at that time to the leaders and politicians of the world to put aside their differences and to work towards peace. And this call was ignored for the most part, except for one person, Queen Victoria, who thought this was a good idea. And she was in Romania. But the rest of the European leaders, American leaders, ignored this encouragement. And so we then descended into World War I. This was our first major war on a global scale. And it was very bloody. And of course, we all know the history of World War I is massive casualties and massive horror. People couldn't imagine that the whole world could fight with one another. But this was now possible given advance of technology, people can move around. Then we saw 3 stages following World War I where there were genuine efforts towards achieving peace, but they all fell short due to some flaw. So the first stage was after World War I. We had the attempt to achieve the League of Nations with the Paris Peace Conference in the 1920s. And the League of Nations reflected some hope towards achieving a peaceful outcome, but it was also only reflected a small number of nations, for example. And we'll talk a little bit about what was missing at the end. So then we descended again into World War II, which was then considered the bloodiest conflict in human history. People were shocked that the world could descend into, such a major crisis with so many lives lost in World War II. And so immediately after that was the second attempt to achieve peace, and that was through the UN, through creating this General Assembly of Nations that could consult on issues, and also international economic institutions which were developed to help relieve debt, etc., the IMF, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institution. But again, there was a flaw in this, which was that you had, again, a 2-tier structure. There were some nations who had veto power, others who didn't, etc. So then again, we descended again into 30, 40 years later into the Cold War, which was a very scary period for human history, where we came on several occasions during the Cold War to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. There were several instances where the world was very close to nuclear annihilation. We had these weapons which are very destructive, which were, on a few occasions, almost used, right? So that was the Cold War. But then, at the end of the 20th century, we had a series of gatherings. So there was this collective sigh of relief. When the Cold War thawed out, we had these what was called the Millennium Summit and the Millennium Forum, which was the largest gathering of world leaders ever to come sit together and talk about what could be our collective goals for human development. It was also the largest gathering of civil society to consider what is the input of people to these goals, what is best for us as a humanity going forward. So that was an effort to implement this consultative spirit. But since that time, again we've descended into even more division. So now when we read the news, I'm sure many of us read the news and get very depressed in the morning. So many further splits and divisions and subdivisions between people, further manifestations of racism, of prejudice in society, of divisions. So again, we see this precarious situation of the human race, where we could either again fall into a very deep conflict, or we could choose something more constructive. So in 1986, there was a document written called The Promise of World Peace, which was talking about what are the challenges that we need to overcome to achieve peace. And among those is this foundation, this idea of the oneness of humankind, that all humanity is essentially one people. And that the oneness does not imply sameness. It doesn't mean everyone should be the same, or should be uniform, or should think in the same way, or do the same thing. But really what it embraces is that oneness is enriched by the diversity of humankind, that diversity of the human race is what enriches and makes this oneness possible. And we benefit from that diversity, just like a garden benefits from different colored flowers. It makes it more beautiful. So that's this idea of oneness. This is the foundation. And what Baha'u'llah said is that in order to achieve a peaceful world, our institutions, our economic institutions, our political, our social, they have to be built on this foundation of complete acceptance of the oneness of humankind. But of course, obviously, that's very difficult to do in an instant, where we've been trained from very early childhood in many societies to think, oh, our race is better, our way of thinking is better, our way of doing is better, the language is more complete. So everyone is taught in a different way, in a different approach to divide oneself. So to kind of switch over to this idea that we are one people is not an easy task. But I know from the description of your organization, this is one of your objectives, is how to share ideas, explore ideas in a way that we can think how to bring people together. So the other ones were the equality of women and men is another core issue, independent investigation of truth, and then also this idea that universal education is very important to achieve peace. These are some of the prerequisites. So then how are we actually on a practical level able to do this? So one of the activities you mentioned that you're working with children and young people. So this is a very important element. So one of the service projects that many communities around the world who are trying to implement and build capability for consultation is working with young children starting at age 5 until, say, age 11. Because this is when many ideas are formed about who am I and what is my place in the world. And so the content of this is to really talk about the idea of the unity of the human race, the idea of generosity, of humility, many of the capabilities that are necessary for consultation. We can start very early. And then there's also another program which is for adults, for us more mature individuals, to think of spaces to support one another, to build these capacities. And these are called study circles, which is another effort to build these capabilities. And these are also available around the world. In Santa Clara, I know many friends who are doing these projects, and they mainly is the idea is to create a space where people can help support each other to think about our material and our spiritual reality, very much like this group, and how to build those capabilities to help our communities become better, how to build those capabilities to assist children to develop in a more mature way, to embrace this idea of the oneness of humankind. So maybe I will stop there because I think there are many ideas here, and I also want to respect the idea of conversation turn-taking, so I don't want to speak too much. But hear also from you about your ideas and your questions or your thoughts. Maybe we can explore any of these different issues in more depth from your perspective. So I will stop there and welcome your viewpoints. Yes?
Actually, I have a question. So when you talk about, like, in the situation, if you have unanimous agreement, that would be perfect, but most of the time it's not.
Yeah.
So you want the majority opinions. But what if, like, the majority opinions are wrong? And
Right.
this happened a lot of times. Like,
Yeah.
people, like, from, like, either scientific perspective or like Galileo, like, or from, like, just normal life that we know, like, a lot, many times,
Voting.
yeah.
Brexit.
Yeah, so how can we just to agree on the majority opinions?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good question. So sometimes, again, so that's why consultation isn't, like when I look at it, it's not just a procedural approach, but it's also a spiritual approach. So the majority ideally reflects, is reflecting a purity of motive. So, but it's not always perfect. So in our political system, we see many flawed outcomes. We see outcomes that are can be very destructive. Majority opinion in Nazi Germany was that a certain group should be killed and exterminated and put into a gas chamber. And that was the majority opinion, and that was clearly wrong. So that wasn't consultation, but what you would call terror. That was tyranny, basically. And so the idea here is, how do we change from a method of power-dominated tyranny to consultative, truth-seeking decisions? And these are very different. And so it's a very important question. So right now, many of our political systems, though you may have majority, it's not going to necessarily reflect the best outcome. and many of these outcomes are hurting societies very greatly.
Yeah, actually there are two seemingly like economically difficult questions. The first one is that like you assumed like purity of motivation or something like this, but economists don't believe in this. They believe that everyone, they like the leaders for authoritarian countries like China, they care about how to last their like domination or their power, and in a democratic country, all the leaders only care about one thing, is the votes, right? And this is the first thing that may like make us difficult to reach. Another thing is that people are easily being manipulated, and their minds, they are like free. Although we believe in free will, but scientifically, a lot of like social psychological techniques can really drive people to some like crazy things, like what was mentioned 100 years ago, like starting from so Gustave Le Bon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and all of these stories seems to make it so hard to reach to the three basic assumptions of your whole story. So how do you think, like how large is the distance?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very large. Yeah, I mean, the existing, so what's interesting is that when we think of a future political or economic system, it's very possible that and quite likely that it will be very different from anything that we see at present. Because everything that we see at present, like you say, has some limitation. It's either captured by wealthy interests of wealthy stakeholders. We see that in many governments, increasingly in many governments, it's complete capture of wealthy stakeholders who have certain agendas, who have a very strong hold on the political system. Or we see, seeking votes, re-election. So we can't judge the current systems of politics. So there is a great distance, basically. And you're asking, what is that gap? It's a significant gap. But I think what is a sign of hope is that we see on small scale, like Google, for example, thinking and considering this question and how to encourage groups to do this, at least in the technology sector, or the disaster response sector on a small scale, how to encourage people to develop these, or at the children, an educational level, how to build these capabilities. So it's not a very quick and fast and immediate change. And one thing that's a bit sobering is that in that peace statement I described, it talks about this next stage of maturation of the human race. It can either be achieved through an active, collective, consultative will, where we are rational, we think, okay, this makes sense. It makes sense to make decisions collectively with this idea that we're all in the same boat. And so let's cede a certain level of sovereignty, cede a certain level of control to this collective voice of humanity, for example. That's a rational, thoughtful approach. There's this other approach which is more sobering, which is humanity clinging to this old patterns and traditions and ways that we've done things in the past, and that we then continue in the way that we have been because of so many vested interests, that we then face unmitigated horrors, basically another major war, another major catastrophe that then makes us think, okay, again, we've had 3 of these major global confrontations that have helped us to advance in this direction. But it may, either through collective consciousness or through this terrible sort of alternative approach, at one stage or another, it's the next sort of natural step in the development of human race, is that we have to achieve some level of consensus, some level of harmony or unity in order to survive, basically, in order to exist. And we've seen that, there's actually a small group discussion. It's part of that study circle which I mentioned, which talks about this idea of the collective maturation of the human race. And it talks about this example that we've achieved throughout history increasingly complex levels of organization, from family and clan to tribe to city-state to nation. And now we're at the brink of this collective maturation, which involves the unity of the human race, essentially. And each of these stages has been achieved. The prior stages, clan has been organized and coordinated. City-state has been coordinated. We have municipalities that organize our trash and our taxes and our schools. Then we have nations which have been established, which help with our economic systems, our macroeconomic systems, our trade and development are organized at the national level. All of these have been achieved, whether we liked it or we didn't like it. It's part of our stages of growth, just like an individual grows through different stages. But this next stage is perhaps the most difficult. Just like in the life of an individual, the most difficult and tumultuous stage of growth is when we transition from a teenager into adult. It's when we want to rebel the most and we want to cling the most to the way we see it and want to do it. That's the most difficult stage of transition. And collectively, that's what Baha'u'llah is saying, is that collectively we're at that stage of adolescence, human adolescence, and we have to, then the next stage is human maturity. And maturity is not easy, like you say, so there's a gap there. Between our current systems and institutions and what they will be in the future, if that makes sense. It's a very good question.
I actually have a concern because it seems like we're learning from Google and see some like common pattern. I want to try to apply the whole entire world to make peace. But to in my opinion, it seems like Google is a micro system. It make billions of revenue and it can feed all its engineers. I mean, the resources considered like unlimited. You can do any like experiments in Google, try any things. People won't complain because they can live a decent life, right? But there's a saying like if everyone in the world has the same life standard as U.S. people, we need 3 Earths. So the point is, for the whole Earth, the resources are limited, and unless you teach people, some people can live high standard level, some people are deserved for low standard live. Unless you make people accept this, otherwise there's always conflict.
Yeah. I mean, the discussion about the Google study is in no way an endorsement of Google itself. It was just an interesting study that they did internally to think about how to work together. But yeah, no, and I think Steve, my stepfather has showed, there's a very interesting documentary on Google, which I saw part of, which describes many of the issues you were talking about in terms of copyright protection or privacy protections, about uniformity versus diversity. There are a lot of issues, and I think those are going to become more prominent in terms of, and I'm not an expert or not very knowledgeable in a deep way about Google or its practice, but I think what you're saying in terms of sustainability is very true and very important. How do you sort of find the right uses of the Earth's resources in a way that respects everyone's usage of the Earth, and that is not exactly uniform, but is not also excessive. So one of the things also Baha'u'llah talks about is the extremes of wealth and poverty. And one thing that we've seen just historically is that over the past, say, 100 years, we've had a general rise in income in the Earth. But at the same time, we've seen a tremendous expansion in the gap between the very wealthy and the very poor, to levels of beyond excess, beyond necessity. I mean, people have large quantities of wealth beyond even what a nation has, a few individuals. And so that has also fueled instability in society, like you say, and that's an ethical and a moral question. But at the same time, it's an interesting one because it can't be one of compulsion. It's a tricky one because individuals like you say, have free will. So somehow through their consciousness, there has to be this decision that this is unethical. What I have is exorbitant and unhealthy and actually puts me at risk if I have too much. And people are starting to realize that the huge bunkers they're building underground, or the armaments to protect the wealth, and escape plans, people trying to go into space, trying to like find another, populate Mars as another, they have so much money, it's like, how do I keep it and save it and go somewhere else, or dig a hole in the ground? But we see a few examples of individuals who have recognized this and have pledged to give their wealth over to philanthropic efforts. But this is also one of the big issues that we're facing now, is how do we use wealth, how do we regulate this extreme, also the global tax system. That's something I started to look at a little bit, but we have huge, I used to work as a lawyer for Baker and McKenzie, and part of my job was to help with these tax systems, which would be like, it would fill 5 whiteboards about these like complex mechanisms to divert profit, to put your intellectual capital, in Ireland or Cayman Islands. So you're basically avoiding all tax and it's legal. All of our systems allow this, and governments allow it because it attracts businesses, right? So if you have these loopholes, you're going to get more companies to situate themselves in your territory, right? But trillions of dollars of wealth are avoided in taxes because of these things, and so we don't benefit. Also, we don't have the resource to, which exists in the world. We're not using it properly to address some of these issues. So it's another important question.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. Okay, thank you. So the first big one is, I feel like now we are, so you're talking about how to reach truth, right? And I feel like now we are kind of overloaded by information, and a lot of the information are not really objective, and then some media, they describe just for the same thing, like different media, they describe it very differently. So in that case, I feel lost. I don't know which side to believe.
Yeah.
So in that case, like, how can we get to the truth?
Yeah.
And that's the first question. The second question is about the conflict. So now there's a lot of conflicts. You are in Hong Kong, so you know how serious that is currently, right? So I was in Hong Kong like 2 weeks ago. Yeah, so I witnessed that. So I feel like in conflicts, what caused the conflicts, both sides, they can think in the right way, in the same way. So it's just like they have a preconception that is like very deep inside their hearts, that they have firm belief that what they believe is right, and then they choose what they want to. They choose what they want to believe, and then they didn't look at the full pictures. So they only look at like one side of it, and then they couldn't reach a common ground because they have such a firm belief in whatever they believe.
Yeah.
So in that case, how can they reach peace?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And actually it's interesting, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, his son, said that in China, the people are the most truth-seeking in the world. And he said that's why China will be, well, among the reasons it will be the country of the future, because of this truth-seeking. So how do you seek truth when media is increasingly polarized? So it's very true that now, I think in the 70s, there used to be a law where in a broadcast television network, you had to show both sides of a story. It was a law. But then in the late 70s or so, deregulation that was removed, and so now you have news stations just showing one ideological perspective and not being required to show another perspective. And so you see even more increasingly polarized sources of information that can create so much confusion. So then how do you seek truth? So there's a friend of ours who came over, and she, this is also in one of the study circles, there's this passage which I thought was very interesting. it says, this talks about one of the ideas being this, this detachment or this removal, this overcoming of prejudice in order to seek truth. And here's what it says. It says, we must be lovers of light no matter from what lamp it appears. So the idea of seeking truth is that wherever or in whatever context, we have to look for it. Just like you say, your heart has to burn to look for it. And we can't let the source of that light stop us from accepting that there is some light in there. Even if the lamp is a Hong Kong person, mainland, or whoever, we can't allow prejudice to color our view of or our search for truth. And then it says, we must be lovers of the rose, no matter in what garden it blooms. So wherever there's a fragrance, a beautiful fragrance, we should love it, no matter where it comes from what mouth it comes. Attachment to one lamp can prevent us from appreciating the light when it shines in another. So if we get so attached to a political affiliation, an ideology, a national inclination, a gender or a racial orientation or preference, we may be limited in our ability to see the light that's coming from other sources. So it says attachment to the outer forms and practices can deprive us from understanding the truth. So this is one element. So how do we do this? So one of the interesting things is that throughout history, it's been the role of religion to help us see the spiritual reality of one another. And to help us understand that this is something that connects us. But at the same time, we've seen that religion can be manipulated and become a source of fanaticism and division and conflict. And so, how do we reconcile these two things? So how do we not get attached to the outer form, but rather benefit from the inner reality of these things? So one of the things that Baha'u'llah says about religion in general is that it needs to be renewed over time. So throughout history, we've had many great teachers come and provide information and guidance about our spiritual reality, just as we've had great evolution in our scientific understanding. Like you said, Galileo, we've had leaps in our understanding in terms of our scientific place in the universe. That the sun is something that we are rotating around rather than it moving up and down. So we've had changes in how we see realities, physical reality. In the same way, our understanding of spiritual reality has also evolved, but it also needs to be renewed. It can get corrupted, just like a bug in a database system gets corrupted. People use it for its own purpose, become fanatical, use it as a weapon. So Baha'u'llah says that religion is progressively revealed. It means every 1,000 or so years, there's a new great spiritual teacher whose purpose is to elevate us and to help us to reach our true reality and to help us see each other in the light of the needs of that particular time and help each other, support each other. So so both scientific and spiritual require investigation. And the use of our rational mind and our spiritual capability. They require investigation. And it's not, and so the media question is a very good one, but it's kind of a window into these other, I think, bigger questions. How do we investigate our physical reality and also our spiritual reality? And like you say, it's, and doing our best to look without prejudice at where these things are coming from and what they're saying is one step. You had another question, which was the second part, which I think there was two parts to your...
Yeah, so my first question is about how to get the truth out of such, now we feel like we are overloaded by all the kinds of information. And the second part is about how both sides reach common ground when they couldn't understand each other's, they are
in extreme situation.
When you have an entrenched viewpoint, so like you said, these are when you have very strong attachment to the lamp, not the light. So it's an identification of nationality or political affiliation or language or and what I understand of this passage is our attachment to the outer form is what hinders us from reaching or achieving our understanding of what is the inner reality or truth of the best way forward. So I think, like you were saying, in particular in Hong Kong mainland, there's a lot of prejudice, a lot of assumptions being made, a lot of maybe misinformation that is fueling conflict. And so the challenge is how to try to understand the actual motives, the actual conditions, so that sort of a next step can be achieved and a better result can be achieved in terms of the relationship between. But yeah, that's not a simple, it's not a simple question. Sorry.
Okay. So basically, based on my limited understanding about the consultation process you described, I have a feeling that how the U.S. Congress works is kind of consistent with your consultation method. But I have some questions. As you know, in the United States, any legislation needs to get a majority from both the House and the Senate. But this approach, does not necessarily can reduce the conflicts, and in some extreme cases, it can lead to worse. In the United States, there was a civil war because two sides cannot reach agreement with each other. How do you think about this issue?
Yeah.
Another problem, another question I have is that it seems that this process is very ineffective because in the United States, everyone agrees that healthy care, immigration, are important issues, but the Congress cannot do anything because it cannot get a majority spot.
Yeah. So I have a funny story. So the son of Baha'u'llah, his name is Abdul Baha, and he, I think, had the opportunity to visit a parliamentary meeting, which at the time was even more advanced than, say, U.S. governments. I mean, it had a bit more of a sort of dialogical exchange of views. But he said, he visited this, and there was like a physical altercation in the floor of this parliament, and people were fighting with each other. And he said, this is not consultation, this is comedy. Yeah, this is comedy, this is not consultation. So basically, what we see also in the US Congress, I think you could say a very similar thing about people filibustering for 10 days reading Dr. Seuss. That's not consultation, that's comedy, right? It's not a form of truth-seeking. So all those qualities which we talked about, that the intention is that you take counsel together with purity of motive, radiance of spirit, detachment, with the utmost love and sincerity, and that, so it's really the quality that is the most important foundation for the procedure. The procedure is just, majority of votes prevail if we can't reach uniformity. That's secondary to the spirit that is in place in the consultative process. And it's that spirit which is very, very difficult to encourage and to nurture, but it's really that spirit which your group and this group is really, I think, seeking to develop, is how to look into things and inquire after things. It's also that those spiritual capabilities which are, developed in these children's classes that we talked about, also these study circles which exist. It takes time. It's not an instant. We can't instantly become humble or instantly become detached or instantly try to see someone with a loving eye. It takes a very, very long time and a lot of support, mutual help, mutual encouragement, because so many forces in society want us to act the other way. So what we would see, I think, in our current systems doesn't reflect consultation.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a great question.
I currently have two questions, and the first one builds on top of her question, and the second builds off one of his questions. So basically, the first one is that so with communication, like argument, like for two entities, two parties to collaborate with each other, like even they are trying to argue about a certain topic, there are certain like common shared like beliefs or presumptions that they need to have, like in order like that should act as a foundation in order for them to start like acting like rationally or try to like consider each other with a loving eye. But you know, and also with like the earlier parts of your presentation, like the assumption that are made with this, like with the people who are like seeking consultation, are people who like they at least like they have those like the shared understanding that they want like the mutual benefit, like just they want to seek mutual benefit or things like that. But however, like there are another case that hasn't been covered yet, which are people who, let's say, are power seeking. They don't care as much about the unity, the humanity about those. And like in this case, it actually breaks the presumption that that should act as a prerequisite for two parties to communicate with each other. And I know like there's an author called Hannah Arendt who wrote a book about the origins of totalitarian. And in her book, like she talks about the like banality of evil, talking about that. So basically, like in like there are like an idea in that is that people who like let's say if they just care about themselves, who are really selfish, and they even refuse internally, they refuse to communicate or confess in any other ways. In this case, how can consultation even get started?
Right.
Because that basically there has no common ground to even to have those communications. That's my first question. Second question, I will try to be very quick. So the second one actually is, I forgot. And also the second one, quick. So like earlier we mentioned about like the failure of the first national conference is because certain countries have veto power, and we know that because people we know we need someone who can actually be responsible for like this like decision and like say that hey, like let's do this. This is called leadership, right? However, like this is another idea about the democracy. So in order to reach democracy, we want to give equal sort of speaking rights to people in this room in order to have a better dynamics within a group. So how this like balance and checks can be played out with our need for the equal speaking opportunity, and also we also need people who should act as leaders, something like that.
Okay, those are really great questions. So the first one is about so when you have self-interest and you have seeking for, not concerned about the welfare of others, and that person is engaged in consultation, how do they effectively consult? So basically it can't be a consultation, really. So again, it's these spiritual prerequisites are the core of consultation. And that's why the urgency and necessity of developing these capabilities is so great. Because if you imagine a world where leaders, often as we see it, are driven by self-interest, as desire to get the next vote, making decisions to appear in some way or the other way and to retain power, for example, we're going to very likely see decisions that are not in the best interest of humanity. And that very likely will lead to destructive actions that will hurt people, right? So when decisions are not made with that purity of motive, we see the result, which is not beneficial. And so this is why also the necessity of developing these kinds of capability is so urgent, because we need people who are thinking in a way that is motivated by the interest of the whole. So then the second question is, what about, you were asking about, veto and collective will. So So the specifics of how such a collective approach to decision making is one that I don't have a understanding of completely, but my sense is that this idea of majority opinion, in some sense, is you have, say, councils, or you have groupings, you have bodies where people can deliberate and try to achieve consensus of viewpoint. But if they can't, you take some majority view. Like you say, you have to take some step. You can't be hindered or what is it? You can't let a few voices, or hijack the whole decision-making process and not lead to some results. So you need to have some process. And so my understanding is it's that majority decision that will allow you to kind of take a step. And one interesting thing, so consultation is actually practiced in many, they call them local assemblies throughout the world. And Santa Clara has one, San Francisco has it, Palo Alto has it. There are actually groups of 9 individuals who exist, who are selected by their community to use these principles to make decisions and help their community. They also exist at a national level. They also exist at an international level. So it's interesting to note that there is some small seeds of these being experimented with, and people, and so yeah, majority. So in those, a few of us actually in this room have had the privilege to serve on some of those institutions and to see how these things, operate. And the idea is that if you have to make a decision, in the end, you take a majority view. And what's interesting is that the idea also of consultation is that once we take a decision, part of this principle of consultation is not to criticize the decision after it's made. So once a decision is made, it's to be implemented in unity. That's another principle. So that as a result of the implementation, the practice, say it was the wrong decision, you very clearly recognize that that was the wrong course of action and can correct it. But if, in the alternative, we take a decision, we don't carry it out in unity. Half the people think, I think that's the wrong decision. The other half say, oh, it's the right decision. You'll never know if it was the decision itself that was flawed or the implementation that was flawed. So this is another principle, like you say, is very important in consultation, is that you carry out a decision in unity, and then can correct that decision once it's implemented.
So in practice, you basically object with the idea with some person or some entities to have veto power, right?
So yeah, so you can have many different viewpoints on a particular issue, and then finally you reach some majority view. Okay, let's try it like this and see how it goes. And so then you implement it, and it turns out maybe that, for example, I understand that this was the case. Someone shared this example once, and in Germany, for example, they say, okay, let's set the speed, or let's take all speed limits off and see if this will help reduce accidents. And so everyone carries this out, and then you can see, because all the parts of Germany are doing the same thing, you can see very quickly the result and then can correct or make adjustments. So, but if some are doing it and some are not, and some are, then you can't really tell if that policy was a good policy. So that's one of the ideas.
I have 2 questions. So, okay. So, in terms of politics, is democracy the best mechanism for the government and the people to get the agreement? And the second question is the collapse of the Soviet Union the result of failure to get the agreement between the people and the government?
Yeah, so for the form of political organization, which is best, I can't say. I think that there are certain elements that are strong in different systems that we can learn from. So there are certain elements, say, within a democracy that are strong. For example, the voice, the ability to express oneself, which could be considered a strong element. There are strong elements in kingship, you know, you have respect and the sovereignty. There's strong elements in the central government, you know, in Chinese there's the ability to implement decisions and to take into account different perspectives that are also very strong. So how this future form of government will develop is something beyond any of our knowledge, you know. But I think the idea again is to look at the benefits and the truth of a situation without prejudice or attachment to the outer form or the name. To see what exactly works well in this system or that system, and to consider, you know, how to really blend or mirror or advance or develop something that really draws on the strength of various different systems.
So is there a basic principle like it, which is can be applied to the majority of the countries, and for the government, for the people, to reach the same ground and to resolve the conflicts between them? I mean, is there some basic principles that the humanities should follow?
For reaching, well, I think the basic principle which Baha'u'llah described is this idea of the oneness of humankind. This idea that we are all inherently one people. So if we have this basic understanding, then how we allocate resources in a sustainable way, or allocate our taxes, or allocate or make decisions about borders, for example, it's going to be in a way which reflects the maturity of the human race. But the foundation has to be that acceptance of the oneness of humankind. So I think that would be the core.
Thank you.
Actually, I want to ask a question related to the current situation in Hong Kong, because I know you work in Hong Kong and you work in the law school, and we know like actually, because I talked with like a student from Hong Kong University, and he's like humanities major. He told me like most students who went to protest are either humanities majors or social science majors. So I really want to know, when you teach your class like in law school, like how can you bring this consultative like spirit to them, and like during the current situation, like do you need to like talk them a little bit about it, or like I don't know, maybe the school doesn't want you to talk about anything?
Yeah, so I mean, so one of the interesting ideas or perspective also of the Baha'i faith is not to be involved in partisan politics. So that's an individual principle which I try to follow, which is to not take a particular side, and to either oppose or to strongly advocate for one political party or another. Because essentially the way that the partisan system has been established is inherently divisive. There is conflict embedded in the partisan nature of government. So that's something which I try my best to just to avoid taking any sides, which is not easy, especially when we're all embroiled. But one thing I do try to do in the class is to really encourage small group discussion, and not about these issues, but we talk about, I do research methods, I teach research methods, and also arbitration, law. So yeah, we talk and try to find ways so that people feel comfortable to express their views. That's one thing I try to do in the class. And that's it, but we don't, I avoid the sort of political issues because it's a divisive issue.
Yeah, following this, I have recently heard about some sense that why these recent unrests are mainly directed by young people. It seems that in Hong Kong, people have a very large cognitive gap between this large gap is usually have they experienced the life before 1987? Yes, they have a lot of discrepancies in how the world is like, how the past was like, how now is like. Yeah, and so in your opinion, standing from a kind of a more objective way, so what is the key thing that makes such a huge cognitive gap between generations in Hong Kong.
So I think, what you're talking about, this cognitive gap, we saw it in the various periods of time between World War I and World War II, and the Cold War, and this increased factionalization. People forget that there are impacts and results of our tendencies and choices that result in either chaotic or less chaotic situations. So, yeah, I think in terms of, I think it's a real issue that we can get detached sort of from recent history and think about what's exactly in our current situation and forget about the impacts of certain patterns. But in terms of that particular issue, you said 89 before and after, or
Before 1997.
97 before and after. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I think that there are, I think that a number of, part of it is what I'm observing of students. I think there's also this just increased pressure, economic pressure facing many young people in terms of being able to afford housing. That's, I think, a core issue. Like people, and that's not unique to Hong Kong. I mean, I think many cities face this issue of how do you achieve material and other objectives in a sort of sustainable way. But yeah, this particular issue, it's an interesting one to look into, whether people...
Yeah, it seems that these young people in Hong Kong, they seem to not have the ability to use counterfactual thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So Hong Kong's economy has been in a disastrous mess in recent years.
Mm-hmm.
And if without the special support from the mainland, Hong Kong would just collapse into nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And people seem to be, actually those people who have experienced more who tend to be more experienced in the past, they seem to be more rational in thinking about this. So we do not want to arouse so many conflicts, because we know that we are relying on this in our life. We get money, we get the way of we are able to make a living because
symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, and but those people who have not been into the real society, they seem to be not sensitive of this. For example, they have born very rich people, young people, most young people in Hong Kong, especially who go to large, good universities. They were born very rich. They are not conscious that we rely so much on a kind of a very solid, multi-dimensional collaboration with the mainland.
Yeah.
They are it's kind of, as you said, this kind of is a human adolescence. This is kind of not totally a result of not being mature.
And that's a great segue. Actually, I brought a discussion sheet, so I thought maybe we'd take a little bit of time, if it's okay with you, to discuss in small groups. Because sometimes in large groups, some people feel comfortable and others don't feel so comfortable to speak. So I thought to give more chance for more people to share their input, we might break into some groups. And I have a little passage. It's from this second book of this study circle sequence. It's called Arising to Serve, and it's about the idea of the maturation of humankind. So it has a passage, and then some questions about, maybe just could discuss the passage, or if you want to discuss some of the questions. And then there's another one on peace, which we talked about too, this sort of how this consultation relates to maturity as well as peace. So there's another section on that. So maybe if it's okay, we take a little bit of time to break into some groups and we can read and consider these ideas. And my friend Shahani, my dear friend Shahani, who's studied this material, can maybe help with one group. And I can also, and I don't know. So we can split up maybe into three, how many we have here? About 20 or so. Say three, maybe 3 groups is a good number, so we don't have it too small. And maybe one group can meet here, one group in the back there, and maybe, I don't know if anyone wants to be outside, we take a few, and maybe spend about 20, 30 minutes. Let's see, we have, you go until 6, right? Oh, 5:20. So 20 minutes, and then we could come back and share any insight from our group discussion. So yeah, maybe one group here, one group in the back, and maybe